Welcome to Spotlight on Climate. Today in the studio we have Jolene. Welcome, Jolene.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And Jolene, tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to this subject.
I'm a biologist. I consider myself a scientist first. And really, the reason I got into biology when I was younger is because it is just so amazing. The diversity out there is so amazing, and how everything has co-evolved and works together in these complex ecosystems has just been, it's amazing what's out there. It's unimaginable. And so I fell in love with biology, became a biologist. Most of my background has been in molecular biology, which, I realize is not necessarily what we're talking about today, but it really did teach me how to do research and look things up for myself and really look at evidence and data and judge for myself. And that's how I got into
Climate science.
Looking at the environment, and the destruction of some of these things that I found a long time ago.
Word destruction actually leads us into what you'd really like to talk about today, which is the food system and how it plays into all of this.
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's not necessarily the most popular idea.
Well, some of the news we're going to hear is not going to be good.
Yeah, I want to talk about how our food system really is impacting the environment as a whole, and with a focus on, I guess, a spotlight on climate change there too. And it's a really important piece that is going largely ignored, precisely because it's uncomfortable to talk about a thing that's deeply personal to a lot of people, and we don't like to have to think about really changing the way that we're eating, changing the way that we're producing food.
And changing the way we produce food is a loaded statement. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, the food system is responsible for a really good chunk of the greenhouse gas emissions. So in addition to fossil fuels being a problem, our food system, it's responsible for at least a third of all of our greenhouse gas emissions globally.
Really?
Yeah.
A third? That's a substantial amount.
It is, and a lot of scientists believe that that's really a gross underestimate, and we can talk about why that is. But if we are going to tackle the climate problem, we cannot just focus on fossil fuels. We have to incorporate these food system changes if we're going to come anywhere close to staying below that 1.5 degree Celsius temperature target that we're talking about.
So what are some of the ways that's a two-part question, I guess, because the way that it's produced is one issue. Our diet is another issue. And I've just thought of a third one. What we do with food, as in food that spoils or food that gets thrown in the trash. How will that impact the situation?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I guess the way that we eat and the waste that comes out of our food system really is all impacted by our diets, what we're choosing to eat and what's put in front of us too.
And by that you're including production and dietary, what we eat.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so really the biggest factor in the food system that's impacting our environment is animal agriculture. And so us eating meat, dairy, and eggs, that is the biggest contributor and the biggest problem. And a large part of that is because our farming system, our entire crop production, a significant portion of that, like 83% of all of the farmable land that we're using, goes to raise crops to feed those animals.
Okay, 83% of what we grow is fed to animals?
Yes, that is correct.
I'm not okay with that.
Yeah, that's where our land use is going, is to feed these animals. And so really we're raising and killing like 10 times as many land animals as there are humans on the earth. So yeah, this
10 times.
Yeah, this is a figure that a lot of people don't realize, is that, we forget that these animals that are being, produced for our food, we have to feed them, and we have to feed them a lot. And it's a really highly inefficient system because, if you think back to your early biology days where you learned about those trophic levels, eating lower on the food chain, there's much less of that, energy loss between those trophic levels. So us eating plants is way more efficient because we're getting all of those calories firsthand rather than filtering them through these animals and eating higher up the food chain.
For me, I don't like meat, so that's one of the primary reasons I stopped eating meat years ago. But it was based on the fact that I don't really like it that much. I don't miss it. I don't like it that much. Now, I know some people are really into meat, any kind of meat, but I know some people who buy their meat from the grocery store and some people who hunt for their meat. Is there a difference?
Oh, well, sure. There's a huge difference there. Buying your meat at the store, that is where really it's close to 99% of all of our meat that is sold is produced on these factory farms. That's what you're buying in the store. And those are the ones that are having the most impact. But even buying meat that's, where the animals are raised differently, like grass-fed beef, and all of these, different ways of producing meat, even with those, accounted for, these are still the most inefficient ways for us to be getting our food. With hunting, I think that's a really, really small part of where we're getting our meat. And, don't forget about the dairy and the eggs in there too.
Oh, right.
So, yeah, I think that one's not really often factored into these models just because it's such a small part of where we are getting our meat.
So factory farming, whether it's meat or plants, is a problem.
Yeah, so factory farming typically applies to animal agriculture. So us using these animals really as commodities. They're things to us. They're not living beings, which they are, They have families, they have feelings, and, we're treating them as commodities in the system. But yeah, it is the raising of those plants or those crops to feed those animals and then having those animals on these confined animal feeding operations, basically these CAFOs, and then trucking them to the slaughterhouse and then to the meat packing industry. All of that is part of this factory farming.
Yeah, well, the CO2 comes into the picture too because you have to transport the meat to the factory and then you have to transport it from the factory to the store. So there's a lot involved in that chain. And the phrase I use all the time, I'm sure people are really tired of hearing it, is the ankle bone is connected to the shoulder bone. And it's that in between that seemed to be, intangible to most people. They don't have something solid. So would you say that the way we eat is important or unimportant?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. I mean, you mean the way that we eat, like
what we eat and how we eat a lot at one time, eating the wrong foods or our diet, basically.
Yeah, definitely. There's been a lot of science that has come out recently that's really analyzing the impacts of all of these different foods, like the top foods that we eat. And this is where that meat, dairy, and eggs are coming out on top as not only the largest greenhouse gas emitters, but they are also using the most land, using the most fresh water. That's where most of our freshwater use goes, is to water the crops to feed these animals. Most of the water pollution in the form of these fertilizers, that's where those are coming on top. Yeah, those are coming out on top significantly. Whereas these plant-based foods, there are some differences there too. And what else is important is where these foods are grown, and because where they're grown can affect the microclimate there. And so sometimes growing something in California versus someplace else might have a larger impact.
So in Arizona, the thing that would come to mind for a lot of people, I would hope, is the growing of alfalfa in southern Arizona, which is not a desert crop, correct?
Sure. Yeah. And so, taking those factors into account, we can really look at which of those products or food, these food items and where they're grown is having the most impact. and we can cut down that way. But the fact that meat, dairy, and eggs are coming out on top of all of these environmental factors, that is the first thing that we should and need to be addressing.
So, do you know anything about the fake meat that's out on the market now? What is that a solution? Is that better? What do we have going there?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And in fact, I attended a webinar where these expert scientists presented their recent cycle assessment study that looked at precisely that, the environmental impacts of plant-based meats versus our traditionally grown meats, looking at, cows, pigs, and chickens. Those are the biggest ones for us. And then looking at the highest selling plant-based meat products too, broken down by their ingredients. And they didn't just look at greenhouse gas emissions and their global warming potential, but they looked at land use, freshwater use, and freshwater eutrophication, or looking at all that. And the results were staggering. So in most of those categories of environmental impact, the plant-based meats were resulting in at least 90% reduction in those impacts.
Really?
Yeah. The only one where there was not a 90-some% decrease was in land use. And in that case, a lot of the plant-based meats were coming out on par with chicken. Still very significantly less than like the pigs and the cows, or, pork and beef. But as you know, chickens are raised so confined and they eat a lot less, right, than pigs and cows, that they do take up quite a bit less land. And so that's where the plant-based meats were coming out.
I always thought in the plant-based meat category, my thought was, well, it uses a lot of water, but we're not putting CO2 in the air. Is that a rationalization, or is that a true fact?
It's definitely true that both of those are true. They use a lot of water to grow those crops, and any time that you are adding processing to foods, like processed foods, they also have significantly more environmental impact than whole foods, going to the store and buying produce or grains or beans and legumes, where, anytime you're adding that processing step, you are losing energy, you're losing some waste is being expelled. And so they're not as efficient as those whole foods. So they are going to use a little bit more water, definitely emit more greenhouse gases. But for this analysis that, was ISO certified and everything, so it's a very good study for that to show that there's these, 90+% reductions. And these plant-based meats are amazing. Like, a lot of people poo-poo them, but I've seen time after time, that these, not conducted this myself, but I've seen where people are easily fooled on which one's the real meat or not. And it's quite entertaining.
That is quite entertaining. So in the few minutes that we have left, Jolene, can you tell us, do you have anything that you would like to see people do? Any solution-oriented ideas, I should say, that people can do right now?
Yeah, and so this is one of the reasons that a lot of people think that this is the most important solution, is because, tackling this problem, it empowers individuals. Like, we can do this now. You can do this now.
This is something that is tangibly right now.
Right now, and it's easy to do, and the alternative energy is already there. It's in the grocery store. You just buy something else. And I know it's tough to think about, right? But, I tell people, if I can do it, anybody can do it.
Well, and it's also simplistic in nature.
It's very simple. And, we don't have to lobby anyone. We don't have to go for these policy changes. Our choices will directly impact the market and force these changes. This is absolutely what needs to be done. We do need support from leadership and governments.
Legislation.
Media. Of course we will.
Okay.
But, what history has shown really is that what drives that is people, the people's choices. So, we can do this now.
So our message to people would be that your personal footprint makes a difference.
It absolutely makes a difference. And there was a recent study done that showed, by adopting this plant-based diet, so shifting your diet can reduce an individual's environmental footprint by 75%.
Wow.
It's huge.
That's huge.
It is absolutely huge.
That's huge. Well, thank you for being with us, Jolene. I really appreciate that perspective because it gives people something tangible that they can do right now, being a part of it. I know for me, I want to feel like I'm contributing to the solution, not contributing to the problem, which I know I do. I know we all do, but I appreciate their perspective that you've given us, that we can have an impact when we're not even realizing that we're having an impact at that time.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me and being willing to really listen and talk about this topic, because it is a tough one to think about, and it is being largely ignored.
And that's a shame too. Again, I repeat that this is something that people can do themselves. It doesn't require legislation, which, like you said, I agree, we need. But this is something people on the ground can do right now.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. So thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you being with us on Spotlight on Climate. Thank you for joining us, Jolene, and we'll see you next time.
Spotlight on Climate is brought to you by the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance in conjunction with 101.5 FM Radio Sunnyside. Our host is Talyne Corlyn. This broadcast is produced by David Bull. Stefan Sommer serves as executive producer. For feedback to Spotlight on Climate or to learn more about the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance, visit nazcca.org.